Welcome back, brave travellers. Tonight, we investigate 3 chilling stories, all based on viral reports and urban legends from Asia. We're going to the gateways of the lost, a forgotten airport terminal, a silent guest house, and a train platform where the schedule never changes. In each place, a person vanished. Their mistake? A single, simple act, offering help, staying one night too long, or looking where they shouldn't. What did they see? Stick with us to find out. And make sure you're subscribed. The journey starts now. Story 1. Gate 19. Flight with no destination. The air in Don Muang was a tangible thing. A thick, wet soup of jet fuel, floor wax, and the distant, tempting aroma of somebody else's noodles. Brian Pham felt it clinging to his skin. A second layer over the grime of a 12-hour layover. He was, by profession, a man who captured moments. As a photographer, he lived in the fractional seconds of a shutter click. But here, in the purgatorial buzz of Bangkok's old airport, time was a sludge. It didn't pass, it accumulated. Brian was exhausted, not just tired, but a deep, cellular exhaustion that comes from chasing invoices, placating clients, and living by the whims of budget airline schedules. He was a freelancer, a content creator, an entrepreneur, which was a polite way of saying he was a one-man band who hadn't had a proper holiday in 3 years. The Phnom Penh gig was good money, but at this moment, staring at the chaotic departures board, he'd have paid $1,000 for a proper bed and 8 hours of silence. He pulled his mobile from his pocket. No signal. Of course. Just the spinning wheel of connecting. Bullshit, he muttered, scrubbing a hand over his face. The main concourse was a sensory assault. Bright, screaming duty-free shops promised synthetic happiness in bottles and bags. Queues snaked from currency exchanges. The digital board flickered, a mess of destinations. Chiang Mai, Phuket, Kuala Lumpur. But his flight, the 11:40 to Phnom Penh, was listed with a frustrating status updating. He needed clarity. He needed a gate. He trudged past a shuttered smoothie bar, the acidic smell of old pineapple hanging in the air. He was looking for an information desk, an official, anyone who looked like they knew what they were doing. And that's when he saw her. She wasn't standing with the other airline staff. She was separate, standing near a stark, grey service corridor. Her uniform was the first thing that snagged his attention. It was a deep, almost black teal, cut in a severe, retro-futuristic style that reminded him of a 1960s vision of air travel. It was immaculately pressed, yet it seemed to absorb the light around it. There was no logo, no jaunty scarf, no plastic name badge. She was watching him, not with the bored indifference of airport staff, but with a still, patient focus. Brian changed course. "Excuse me," he said, the word catching in his dry throat. "I'm trying to find the Phnom Penh flight. The board's no help." She didn't smile, but her expression was not unkind. It was neutral, resolved. Her voice, when she spoke, was low-mid, melodic, and cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a blade. "You are going to Phnom Penh," she stated, not asked. "Yes, the 11:40. If it's still running." She tilted her head, just slightly. "Your flight is not here. Your gate is elsewhere." "Elsewhere? What?" "A different terminal." "No," she said. She held his gaze. "Your gate is un." Brian blinked. He'd just walked the entire length of the terminal. It ended at 46. "There is no gate 9. I just came from that way." "It is at the end," she insisted softly. "It is very easy to miss." A flicker of annoyance. Was this some bureaucratic runaround? "Look, can you just tell me where the—" "Gate 19. This time, she didn't just say the words. She whispered them, and the sound was utterly wrong. It wasn't a human whisper, full of air and moisture. It was a dry, sibilant sound, like sand pouring in a vacuum. It didn't just enter his ears. It felt like it had been injected directly into his brainstem. A shiver, completely unrelated to the ambient temperature, traced a line down his spine. He was too tired to argue. Maybe it was a new wing, a budget carrier annex they hid from the general public to avoid embarrassment. Fine, he sighed. Which way? She pointed, not towards the concourse he had just left, but back, towards the shuttered smoothie bar and the grey service corridor. Past the old wing, keep going until you see the sign. Thanks, he said, already turning, pulling the handle of his roller bag. When he glanced back a second later, she was gone, not walking away, just gone. The space she had occupied was just empty air. Brian shook his head. Jet lag, dehydration. He started walking. The further he walked, the more the airport fell away. The bright, garish storefronts of 7-Eleven and Boots gave way to unbranded, forgotten shops. The windows were papered over. The mannequins in a dusty, closed tailor's shop, frozen in poses from a forgotten decade. The polished marble floor became scuffed linoleum, the seams curling up like old parchment. The sounds changed first. The roar of the crowd, the announcements, the endless loop of airport pop music. It all receded, replaced by a low, insistent hum. It was the sound of failing electricity, a high-voltage buzz that set his teeth on edge. Then the visuals, the lighting, which had been aggressive LED white, shifted to a sickly, flickering yellow. Long fluorescent tubes in the ceiling sparked and guttered, casting shadows that danced with a life of their own. The air became cold, a damp, heavy chill that felt less like air conditioning and more like the inside of a cellar. He was utterly alone. His footsteps, which had been lost in the terminal's din, now seemed monstrously loud. The click-clack rumble of his roller bag echoed in the corridor, a rhythm of his own rising panic. Click-clack rumble. He stopped. The echo continued for a beat too long. Click-clack rumble, as if something, somewhere ahead in the gloom, was matching his pace. He pressed on, faster now. The corridor stretched. This wasn't right. Airports were designed for flow, for movement. This place was a bottleneck. It was a trap. The walls seemed to be weeping, a thin film of condensation covering the peeling paint. He saw an old poster for an airline that had gone bust in the 80s. The pilot's smile, a ghostly grimace. He felt like he was being watched. Not by a person, but by the building itself. He imagined the grainy, high-contrast flicker of a security camera, an unseen eye recording his progress. He was no longer a passenger. He was a specimen. He saw it. Finally, a sign. It wasn't a modern, backlit sign. It was an old, 80s-style black box with glowing orange digital numbers, most of which were dead. But two figures were clear. 1 turned to 9. It wasn't a gate. It was just an end, a dead stop in a corridor that should not exist. There was no jet bridge, no smiling staff, no queue of fellow travellers. There was only a set of black-tinted automatic doors that refused to open, and next to them, a single, dead electronic display. The humming was loudest here. The cold was a physical weight. "You've arrived." Brian spun around. She was there, the attendant. She hadn't walked up. She was simply there, standing by the dead screen as if she were the most natural thing in the world. "What is this?" Brian demanded, his voice cracking. "This isn't a gate. This is a service area. Where is the flight?" She smiled, and it was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. It was a smile of completion, of a transaction finished, a parcel delivered. It did not touch her cold, neutral eyes. "You have arrived at your gate," she repeated, her voice the same melodic, hypnotic monotone. "This is your destination." "You're taking the piss," he shouted, his voice sounding thin and small in the vast, cold silence. "My ticket is for Phnom Penh." He fumbled in his jacket, his fingers numb. He pulled out the crumpled boarding pass. "See? Phnom Penh, PNH." He held it out, a trembling piece of paper as proof of his reality. And as he held it, he watched it happen. There was no flame, There was no heat, but the paper began to burn. It started at the edges, a black, creeping char, like frostbite in reverse. The paper didn't burn away. It simply became ash, the fibers collapsing in on themselves. The blackness consumed the barcode, the seat number, the destination, P&H, turned to dust. The paper was cold, so cold it stung his fingers. But he couldn't let go. He watched, horrified. As the black crept towards the center, he looked up at her. "What's happening?" he whispered. "You were a passenger in transit, Mr. Pham," she said, her voice now barely a breath, the dry, sandy whisper. "Now you have reached your terminus." The last of the paper turned black in his hand. He heard a sound, a faint, dry crinkle, the sound of burning paper, but without the fire. The dead electronic board above her head flickered once. For a single second, it was no longer blank. It displayed one word in stark, orange letters: arrived. The empty corridor stretched out behind him, a dark, echoing void. The black doors in front of him remained sealed. The electric buzz filled his head. Brian Pham, photographer, freelancer, entrepreneur, stood perfectly still in the non-place between worlds, holding a handful of cold ash. He had been processed. The system had claimed him. He was no longer waiting for a connection. He was the connection. And the gate, he finally understood, was not a place you passed through. It was a place you stayed. Story Room 4A, the door that never closes. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:00 a.m. Hanoi. The city outside was finally, deeply asleep. Even the relentless chaos of the old quarter had succumbed to the humidity and the dark. The only sound was the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the ancient ceiling fan. Slicing through the air in room 4A, Emily Tran was wide awake. She hadn't come to Vietnam to sleep. She'd come to escape. Back in Chicago, her life was a curated series of investor pitches, 80-hour work weeks, and the constant, grinding pressure of her fledgling startup. She was a content strategist, a founder, a creator, which really just meant she was professionally burned out. Hanoi was supposed to be the reset, a month of authenticity, faux, and asynchronous work from a time zone no client could reasonably reach. The guest house on Hangback Street was part of that authentic package. It was cheap, historic, and deeply inconvenient. The stairs were narrow enough to demand single-file passage. The walls were thin, and the air held the permanent, layered scent of incense, damp plaster, and fish sauce. Her room, A, was at the end of a long, narrow hall. For the first few nights, it had been perfect. A simple bed, a sturdy wooden desk for her laptop, and a door with a heavy, old-fashioned bolt. Until tonight, or more accurately, until 2 nights ago, the first time it happened. She'd been jolted from a shallow sleep. The sound had been subtle, a metallic click, followed by the sound of old wood swelling and groaning, a creak that seemed to last just a fraction too long. When she'd opened her eyes, the heavy door to her room was open a full 6 inches, revealing a slice of the pitch-black hallway. She chalked it up to the building settling, the humidity warping the frame. She'd gotten up, bolted it, and gone back to sleep. The second night, she was working, lost in a content matrix. She heard it again. Click, creak. The door swung open. This time, annoyance prickled. She had, with considerable effort, dragged a heavy wooden chair from the desk and wedged it under the brass knob. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Now, at 3:10 a.m. on the third night, she was just watching, waiting. Her laptop was closed. Her glass of water sat untouched. She stared at the chair, her arms crossed, her body rigid. She felt the air pressure in the room change before she heard the sound. It was a subtle drop, a sudden coldness that had nothing to do with the struggling air conditioner. The clock ticked over, 3:16 a.m. Her breath hitched. The fan blades seemed to slow, 3:17 a.m. The sound was clean, precise, and utterly impossible. Click. The bolt, which she had physically checked twice, slid back. She saw the brass nub retract with her own eyes. Then, the creak began. The door pushed against the chair. It didn't slam, it pushed. The chair legs screeched against the tiled floor, a high-pitched, agonizing sound. As the door relentlessly, smoothly opened, it pushed the chair back, inch by inch, until the entryway was clear. The door settled, wide open, inviting the suffocating darkness of the hall into her room. Emily's panic wasn't the screaming kind. It was the cold, sudden, professional kind. The kind she felt when a critical server failed or a funding round collapsed. It was a sharp, focused dread. She was out of bed in an instant, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She slammed the door shut, ignoring the shiver that ran up her arm as she touched the wood. She fumbled with the bolt, shooting it home. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Absolutely not." She turned, breathing hard, and backed away from the door. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for… what? An intruder? A mechanism? This was a building, not a haunted house. There had to be a logical. That's when she saw it. On the desk, precisely where her laptop had been, sat a small, folded piece of yellowed paper. It was not hers. She hadn't put it there. She'd been staring at that desk, at that door, for the past 10 minutes. This was the pivot, the moment the familiar world tilted and the rules no longer applied. Her mind screamed, "Don't touch it." But her hand was already reaching. It was the impulse of a problem solver. Analyze the data. The paper was brittle, the ink a faded brown. The handwriting was an elegant, looping script, written in Vietnamese. She couldn't read the words, but she knew, with a sickening certainty, that she didn't need to. As if summoned by her gaze, the ink seemed to resolve, shifting, the letters blurring and reforming. It was English. "Whoever stays in room 4A can stay as long as they like. The door will always be open." A small, choked sound escaped her. "Can stay as long as they like." It wasn't a welcome. It was a diagnosis. She grabbed her keycard and her phone. Driven by pure adrenaline, she ripped the door open and sprinted, barefoot, into the hallway. The stairwell was at the far end, past 3A and 3B. The light from a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a diseased, flickering glow. The walls here weren't white. They were painted a sickly, institutional green. The bulb hummed and flickered, making the shadows leap and twitch. As she reached the landing, a sound drifted up from the lobby below. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the buzz of the light. A low, monotonous chanting. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her feet slapping against the cool concrete. She burst into the lobby. It was empty, illuminated only by the red glow of the PHO sign outside. "Hello?" she yelled. Her voice cracked. "Xin Chao!" A figure stirred from a cot behind the reception desk. The night manager, an old man she'd only ever seen sleeping, sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Problem, miss?" he mumbled. "My door," Emily panted, holding up the note. "Room 4A. The door. It won't stay. What is this?" The old man's eyes focused on the paper. The colour drained from his face. He didn't look startled. He looked defeated. He looked up at her, his gaze filled with a pity that was far more terrifying than any ghost. "You are in 4A, he stated. "Yes, what is wrong with that room?" The old man looked away, toward the street, as if checking for eavesdroppers in the empty 3 a.m. darkness. "That room," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That hall, not always guest house. What was it?" Emily demanded. He met her gaze. "Toi Chien," he said. "The war. That room. It was a morgue, a temporary one, for the soldiers, for the ones who didn't fit elsewhere." a wartime morgue. The words detonated in the silence. The coldness she'd felt in the room wasn't the AC. It was a cold that came from the concrete, from the plaster, from the memory of the place. "The door will always be open," she whispered, reading the note again. "They wait," the old man said, his eyes distant. "They welcome new guests." That was it. The pitch was over. The deal was dead. "I'm leaving," Emily said. It wasn't a request. She wasn't packing. Her laptop, her passport, none of it mattered. The sunk cost fallacy wasn't going to claim her. She lunged for the guest house's heavy front door. She grabbed the handle. She pulled. It didn't budge. She pulled again, harder, throwing her weight against it. Nothing. She fumbled for the lock. It was a heavy, modern deadbolt, supplemented by a thick iron hasp. Both were fastened. Locked. "Open it," she said, her voice rising to a thin, sharp shriek. "Open the door, now." The old man shook his head slowly, his face a mask of regret. "I cannot." "What do you mean? You can't. It's your guest house. Give me the key." "It is not locked, miss," he whispered. "Not by me." "Then who?" The faint chanting from the stairwell suddenly stopped. The buzzing of the lobby lights died, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The only light was the flickering, sick green glow from the stairwell she had just descended. Silence. A heavy, absolute vacuum. Emily turned from the door. She looked at the green stairwell. A shadow moved on the landing above. The flickering bulb illuminated the top of the stairs. A figure stood there, then another, then a third. They were in white, not shrouds, not gowns, but simple, stark white pajamas or medical uniforms, stained with something dark. They stood motionless, 3 shadows outlined against the green. The old man behind the counter began to pray, a quiet, desperate murmur. The first figure took a step, then the second. Slowly, deliberately, the 3 figures in white began to descend the stairs, their bare feet making no sound on the concrete. The chanting didn't resume. There was no sound at all, save for Emily's own breath, which she could no longer feel, and the old man's hopeless, fading whispers. Emily backed against the locked door. Her hands splayed flat against the wood. The figures descended, 1 step at a time, their faces lost in the flickering, deepening shadows. They were coming for their new guest, the one who could stay as long as she liked. Story 3. The fog train. Gone and never arrived. Kevin Inoue believed in schedules. As an educator at a competitive language institute in Osaka, his life was governed by timetables, syllabi, and the predictable, reassuring rhythm of the Shinkansen. He was a man of pragmatism, not omens. This trip, a late-night local express from Kyoto to Kanazawa, was a calculated risk. He'd saved money by avoiding the last bullet train, opting for the slower, meandering route, planning to review lecture notes under the quiet hum of the carriage. Kyoto Station was shedding its last commuters, leaving the platform populated by shadows and the weary. Kevin secured a window seat in a blessedly empty car, plugged in his noise-cancelling earbuds, and opened his laptop. The train departed with a pneumatic sigh, easing out of the station's civilized glow and into the dark, rural canvas of the Kansai night. The work was engaging, but a subtle shift in the environment pulled him from his focus. It wasn't a sound, it was the absence of it. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels on the rails had been subsumed by a low, resonate drone. He looked up. Outside the window, the familiar silhouettes of rice paddies and distant hills were gone. There was only white, a fog, impossibly dense and luminous, pressed against the glass like a shroud. It wasn't mist. It was an occlusion, a total erasure of the outside world. Kevin, mildly annoyed at the loss of scenery, felt the train slowing. Strange. It was far too early for the first scheduled stop. He watched the white void, and it was then he saw the lights, parallel to his own, moving at the exact same speed. Another train. It was strange, but not impossible. A local line running parallel. He peered closer, trying to make out the model. The fog thinned for a fraction of a second, a curtain pulling back, and he saw the interior of the other car. He saw himself. The man in the other train was identical, Kevin Inoue. He wore the same charcoal grey peacoat, had the same weary set to his jaw, the same laptop open on his lap. Kevin's breath hitched. Cognitive dissonance. It was a reflection. It had to be. The fog was creating some bizarre, specular illusion on the window. He raised his right hand to test the theory. His reflection in the window of his train raised its hand, as expected. But the man in the parallel train, the doppelganger, did not. He remained perfectly still, fingers poised over the keyboard, staring blankly ahead. Kevin's pulse kicked. The drone of the fog intensified, vibrating in his teeth. The parallel train, and the other Kevin within it, suddenly accelerated. It didn't speed up. It slid forward through the mist as if propelled by a different physics, vanishing into the white void ahead. Kevin was left staring at his own wide-eyed, genuine reflection in the glass. He ripped his earbuds out. The carriage was silent, save for the hum. He looked around. The few passengers who had been in the car, a sleeping salaryman, 2 teenagers whispering by the door, were gone. He was alone. When did they get off? He hadn't heard a single stop. A digitized chime sounded, tinny and cold. The PA system crackled to life, but the voice was mangled, buried in static. Ksh, mamonaku, ksh. Do not look, Kyoto. Ksh. Platform 7. The words "do not look" registered, but they were lost in the geographic impossibility of Kyoto and Platform 7. The train slowed, sliding to a smooth halt. The doors hissed open. Kevin stared at the station sign, illuminated by the same cold white fog. Kyoto Station, Platform 7. It was impossible. This was a one-way trip. He scrambled for his phone. No signal. His digital ticket app loaded a spinning, corrupted icon. He looked at his watch, a trusted analog automatic. The hands were spinning, slowly, backward. This wasn't a delay. This was a system failure. The doors hissed shut. The train began to move, the low drone resuming its invasive thrum. Kevin was standing now, his laptop forgotten on the seat. He walked the length of the car. It was empty. He moved to the next car. Empty. And the next. Empty. He finally found one other passenger, sitting in the last car. A woman, dressed in simple, dark clothing, staring not out the window, but at the reflection of the carriage floor. "Excuse me," Kevin said, his voice tight. "Did you see that? We're back in Kyoto." The woman didn't look up. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "This is my 4th loop." The statement landed with the existential weight of a verdict. 4th? What do you mean? It's a malfunction, a scheduling error. There were 20 people on my first loop, she continued, her voice a monotone. Then 12, then 5, now. She finally raised her head. Her eyes were vacant, pupils dilated as if she'd been staring into an abyss. "Now there's just us. It takes a few more with every rotation." The train was picking up speed. The fog outside was a churning, white ocean. "What takes them?" Kevin demanded. "You saw the other train, didn't you?" Yes, I saw." "The ghost," she whispered. "The reflection, the echo, it runs beside us. It shows you what you're about to become." The drone in the carriage shifted pitch, becoming a sickening vibratory whine, and then, as before, the parallel train slid into view. Kevin pressed himself against the opposite window, his back to the phenomenon. He wouldn't look. "Don't look," the woman affirmed, her voice cracking. "It's the only rule. It shows you yourself. And when you look, you acknowledge it. You give it permission. You see your replacement, and then you're ready to be taken. Kevin's heart hammered against his ribs. This was madness, a shared delusion. He was an entrepreneur of the mind. He taught logic. This was a stress-induced psychotic break. The PA system crackled again, louder this time. The static was a scream. Cash! Do not! Cash! Look out! Do not look! Cash! It's lying, Kevin breathed, staring at the woman. It's a glitch. It's trying to warn us about something. It's not a warning, the woman said, closing her eyes. It's a command from the train. Kevin's professional skepticism warred with the primal terror crawling up his spine. The entrepreneur in him, the creator, needed to see the problem. You cannot fix what you do not analyze. This woman was compromised, lost in the fallacy. He had to see the mechanics of the trap. The train began to slow. It's stopping, Kevin said. Yes, Kyoto again. I have to see. Don't, she pleaded. It's the last step. You look, you see it. And on the next loop, you're on that train. And the you that's on this train isn't you anymore. The train came to a complete, shuddering halt. The doors did not open. There was a profound silence. The fog drone stopped. It's waiting, the woman whispered. Kevin looked at his own reflection. He saw the sweat on his brow, the fear in his eyes. He looked at the woman. She was crying silently. But I have to know, Kevin said. It was the imperative that had driven his entire career. He turned his head. He looked out the window. The parallel train was there, stopped, just inches away. The fog was gone, replaced by a perfect, sterile blackness between the two carriages. The other car was not empty. It was full. It was filled with the passengers who had disappeared. The salaryman, the teenagers, dozens of others, all standing, packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale and featureless, their mouths open in a uniform. Silent O of despair. They were the ghost passengers, and in the window directly opposite him, where the doppelganger had been, stood a figure. It was Kevin Inoue. It wasn't a reflection. It was a perfect copy. It stared at Kevin, not with malice, but with a terrible, hollow hunger. It slowly raised its right hand and pressed its palm flat against the glass of its own window. A mirror image. Kevin, paralyzed by a horror so complete it felt like an electric shock, found his own body moving against his will. His own right hand lifted, trembling, and pressed itself against the cold glass of his window, perfectly aligning with the palm of the other. The doppelganger smiled. Kevin felt a sudden glacial coldness, not on his hand, but in it, a high-frequency vibration that shot up his arm and into his chest. He tried to pull away, but he was frozen. He looked at the woman. She was staring at him, her face a mask of pity. You looked, she whispered, as the low fog drone began to swell again. Kevin looked back at the window. The doppelganger was gone. The entire parallel train had vanished. He was looking only at his own reflection, but his reflection was smiling, and its eyes were black. The train doors hissed open onto the platform. The sign was stark and clear. Kanazawa. Kevin Inoue stepped off the train. He adjusted his coat, picked up his briefcase, and walked into the station, his mind perfectly clear, his lecture notes forgotten. He had a sudden, intense craving for the cold, salty air of the Sea of Japan. He felt efficient. He felt renewed. He felt, finally, in complete control. Behind him, in the empty, fog-filled carriage of the last train, a laptop lay open on an empty seat. The train doors sighed shut, and it began its slow, inevitable journey back to Kyoto. The spaces that do not release. We, the driven, understand transit. It is the texture of our lives. The airport lounge at 3 a.m., the anonymous hum of a server farm, the non-space of a Zoom waiting room. We are a generation defined by the in-between. We hustle in the gaps, build in the corridors, and innovate on the threshold. We see these places as temporary tools. A sterile hotel room is a place to recharge a laptop and a mind. A red-eye flight is a capsule for focused work. A late-night train car is a moving office. They are means to an end. We call them liminal spaces. The word comes from limen, meaning threshold, a place of transition, waiting, and ambiguity. But the mistake we make in our relentless push forward is assuming that all thresholds are meant to be crossed. We forget that a threshold is also a boundary. These places, the airport gate, the motel room, the train car, they are not just physical locations. They are existential waypoints, suspended from the normal rules of time and consequence. They are the background hum of our ambitious lives, and, for a few, they cease to be a passageway. They become a destination. Their stories are not cautionary tales of monsters or violence. They are quiet case studies of a single, fatal miscalculation. They are stories of successful, intelligent, and driven people, much like us. And they all made the same error. They shared one defining trait, a professional, weaponized curiosity. In our world, curiosity is the engine of innovation. It's what separates the founder from the follower. But in the world of the night, in the suspended reality of the liminal, curiosity is not an asset. It is an answer. It is a signature on a contract. It is an irrevocable invitation. Lynn was an auditor, not just by trade, but by nature. Her entire career as a freelance risk consultant was built on an inability to accept a surface-level answer. She diagnosed systemic rot in complex organizations. She found the hairline fracture in the database, the logical fallacy in the business plan, the one employee who was siphoning fractional sense. She was, by any measure, brilliant. And she was exhausted. She was in the international terminal of an unnamed airport. The architecture was all glass and steel, a monument to antiseptic efficiency. Her flight was delayed. 3:17 a.m. The terminal was a ghost town, populated only by sleeping cleaning staff and the rhythmic buffing of a floor polisher miles down the concourse. She sat, her laptop burning her legs, reviewing a deck, but her focus was fractured. Her professional curiosity, usually so precise, had become restless. It snagged on an anomaly. At the far end of her concourse, past the shuttered duty-free and the darkened coffee kiosks, was Gate 44B. It wasn't on the departure board. The glowing blue sign that should have designated a city and a flight number was blank, emitting a cold, static white light. It was an operational error, a dead link in the system. Lynn's mind, trained to find and fix such errors, wouldn't let it go. It was a problem to be solved. She packed her laptop and walked. The air grew stiller as she moved away from the main hub. The piped-in classical music faded. The only sound was the precise, expensive click of her heels on the polished terrazzo. She arrived at Gate 44B. It looked wrong. The gate furniture was older, upholstered in a faded 1970s orange. The signage font was different. It was an analog pocket in a digital world. The jet bridge was connected, a dark tube extending into the fog outside. But the door to the bridge was slightly ajar. Lynn stopped. This was not her business. Her flight would be called. She should return. But the what if was deafening. What system failure was this? What was on the other side of that door? A dormant plane? A storage area? Her mind presented a dozen logical explanations. But her instinct, the instinct that made her the best, smelled an inconsistency. And inconsistencies had to be resolved. It was the hubris of the successful, the ingrained belief that all systems yield to scrutiny. She wasn't just curious, she was auditing. She pushed the stainless steel door. It opened not into the hollow, metallic tube of a jet bridge, but into a silence so profound it felt like pressure. The air was cold and stale. It smelled of dust and ozone. She stepped inside. The door, heavy and perfectly balanced, swung shut behind her with the sound of a bank vault ceiling. It was not a click. It was a thud of finality. Lynn turned. Suddenly cold, she pushed the bar. It didn't budge. She pushed again, this time with her shoulder. The disciplined panic of a problem solver hitting a true firewall. The door was just a wall, a solid, immovable piece of metal. She looked into the darkness of the tunnel. It was no longer a jet bridge, it was just a corridor, stretching into an impossible, featureless distance. The faint white light from the gate sign did not penetrate it. She was in the system's error message, a 404 error, rendered in steel and silence. Lynn, the auditor, was still there. She is still there, a permanent resident of the interstitial space she was just supposed to be passing through. She simply looked. And the void looked back and invited her in. Javier was a founder. His life was a series of 18-hour days, fueled by caffeine and a desperate, burning need to build. He had just driven 9 hours from a failed pitch meeting. The VCs had called his idea derivative. His seed money was drying up. He was vibrating with a toxic mix of exhaustion and cortisol. He checked into the only place available, a roadside motel called the Starlight Inn, where the S and L in the neon sign flickered, spelling tar tight every third second. His room was number 12. It was aggressively beige. He threw his bag on the bed, the springs groaning in protest. He just needed 4 hours of sleep before driving back to liquidate his dream. But he couldn't sleep. A noise from room 13, the adjoining room. It wasn't a TV. It wasn't voices. It was a sound that didn't belong. A quiet, rhythmic tapping, not on the wall, but on the floor. A hard, wooden on linoleum sound. Tap, 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 tap. Javier squeezed his eyes shut. His frustration over the failed pitch curdled into a petty, laser-focused fixation. This motel, this room, this noise. It was just one more broken thing in a day full of them. It was a problem. He was a builder. He fixed broken things. He got up and pressed his ear to the thin drywall. The tapping was clearer now. It was a pattern, a complex one. It felt less like a sound and more like a code. His curiosity, the same impulse that led him to deconstruct code at 3 a.m., took over. He went to the door and looked through the peephole. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the sick pink and blue light of the tar-tight sign. He looked at the adjoining door, a cheap, plywood rectangle painted a dozen times. He didn't knock. Who would be in room 13 at this hour? He tried the handle. It wasn't locked. This, in itself, was a data point that demanded investigation, a security flaw. He opened the door, just a crack. The room was dark, but the smell that hit him was wrong. It wasn't cigarettes or mildew, it was copper and dust, an ancient metallic dust. The tapping stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. It was heavy, expectant. "Hello?" Javier whispered, his founder's bravado evaporating. He pushed the door open wider. The room was empty. The beds were made. The furniture was identical to his. But the window was open, the cheap curtain billowing inward, chancel, and on the floor, in the center of the room, was a small, dark pile. It wasn't a pile, it was an object, an old, wooden thing, like a child's abacus or a strange, ritualistic counter. As he watched, one of the wooden beads clicked down, seemingly of its own accord. Tap. Javier stared, his brain trying to categorize the impossible. He was a man of systems and logic. This did not compute. He heard a noise behind him, from his own room. He spun around. In the threshold, standing between his world and this one, was a figure. It was framed by the light from his own bathroom. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette whose proportions were just wrong. It was too thin, its joints too sharp. Javier realized his mistake. The adjoining door wasn't an entrance to room 13, it was an exit. The thing in room 13 wasn't the anomaly, it was the bait. The invitation he had accepted was not to see, but to be seen. The tapping hadn't been coming from the floor. It had been a signal, counting down his arrival. The door hadn't been unlocked by accident. It was waiting for his curiosity to turn the handle. Tuan was a creator. His job was to find the stories that hid in plain sight. He was a documentarian of the overlooked, a digital archaeologist. He was on a sleeper train, crossing a remote, unnamed prefecture. He was travelling, as he always did, with his camera. He was hunting for B-roll, shots of mist-covered mountains, reflections on the glass, the lonely light of a distant farmhouse. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels was his soundtrack. He was restless. The train was comfortable, but sterile. He needed a narrative. He walked the length of the train. He passed the sleeping cars, the dining car, closed, and the observation deck. He came to the final car. A simple metal door with a small window. A sign read, "Staff only." But the door was ajar, just a centimetre, a sliver of darkness. This was the shot. This was the story. The forbidden space. His creator brain lit up. He didn't see danger. He saw a cold open. He framed the shot in his mind's eye. The pull of the narrative was stronger than the pull of self-preservation. He pulled his camera up, pressed record, and pushed the door. The car was a luggage hold, but not. It was empty, completely. No bags, no staff, no equipment. It was just a metal shell, colder than the other cars, and strangely quiet. The rhythmic sound of the wheels was muffled, distant. He stepped inside, his camera panning across the emptiness. The visual was striking, a void moving at 100 kilometers an hour. He turned back to film the connecting door for an exit shot. As he focused, he saw a reflection in the small window of the door. It wasn't his. The reflection was of a person sitting in the corner of the empty car he had just panned across. A person who had not been there a second ago. Tuan froze. He lowered the camera. He didn't turn around. He just watched the reflection in the glass. It was of an old woman, dressed in rags, staring directly at him. Her face was pale, her eyes too dark, wet holes. She did not smile. She just watched. His heart hammered. This was impossible. A trick of the light. In the reflection, the woman raised one hand. Slowly, she beckoned. A single, crooked finger, inviting him to turn around, inviting him to engage. Tuan's hand was on the door. He had to get out. The door handle wouldn't turn. It was locked. He heard a sound behind him. The scrape of dry cloth on metal. She was standing up. He was a documentarian. He had spent his life capturing reality. Now, he was trapped in the B-roll. The staff-only sign wasn't a warning to passengers. It was a containment protocol. The car wasn't empty. It was occupied. His curiosity hadn't just opened a door. It had confirmed his attendance. He had been invited, and he had RSVP'd. 3 spaces, 3 professionals, 3 irreversible acts of curiosity. We, who move through the world with such confidence, see these gaps as opportunities. We are trained to look behind the curtain, to read the fine print, to open the adjoining door. Our success is predicated on it, but the liminal spaces do not play by our rules. They are not waiting for investment. They are not open to disruption. They are patient. They are traps designed not for the foolish, but for the clever. They are designed for us. They wait in the reflection on the window, in the silence between the floor taps, in the gate that isn't on the map. They are the anomalies in the system. So the next time you are in transit, in that sterile lounge, that humming motel, that dark carriage, and you feel that familiar itch, that professional need to know, to see, to solve the thing that feels out of place, pause. Remember that in our world, curiosity builds empires. In theirs, it is a key, and when you use it, you are not opening a door. You are proving you are the one they have been waiting for. You are the one who is ready to stay, permanently. The sound of missing the official report, the one the Met circulated and filed, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. Incident at Hexagon Hub, it read. Non-suspicious. I stood in the glass and steel atrium of the building, reading that flimsy A4 summary on my tablet, and I had to admire the sheer audacity of the lie. Behind me, the Thames was a silent, oily ribbon in the pre-dawn light. In front of me, the Hexagon Hub, a £200 million testament to London's fintech boom, was a tomb. My name is Daniel Cole. I am not a detective. I am a loss adjuster. When an insured asset portfolio, in this case, the entire executive team of a startup called Qantas Leap, evaporates overnight, I am the one the underwriters send. I don't look for culprits. I look for liabilities. I calculate the cost of the impossible. The police had finished. The forensics teams had packed up, baffled and frustrated. They had left behind the faint chemical smell of luminol and the chalk outlines on the floor. Not of bodies, but of laptops, of briefcases, of coffee cups left to grow cold. Now, the building was mine. And after the chaos, after the sirens and the shouting, only the sounds remained. At first, it was just the building's standard ambience. The cold drone, as the audio notes described it. It was the sound of money, a deep, subaudible hum from the server racks in the basement, the silent rush of the industrial-grade air conditioning, the high-frequency whine of 1,000 devices in standby mode. It was the sound of a system humming with potential, waiting for its creators, but its creators were gone. I walked from the atrium onto the main work floor, polished concrete, cold and grey as a mortuary slab. My footsteps were the only ones. That was the first lie. The prompt had mentioned Chengjie Trensanda, the sound of shoes on a stone floor. I heard mine, the click of my Loke brogues, echoing in the cathedral-like emptiness. And the echo was wrong. It felt layered. It wasn't that I heard other footsteps. It was that the silence that followed my own footfall felt unnaturally heavy, as if the sound was being swallowed before it could properly return. It was the sound of my own intrusion. The lights were on, not the main overheads, but the automated track lighting. As I moved, sensors picked up my heat and motion, illuminating the path ahead of me and extinguishing the path behind. I was walking through a rolling pool of light, surrounded by a sea of absolute darkness, and then the sound from the prompt, Tiengden Huingquang Nonye. Here, in this temple of modern tech, there were no fluorescent tubes. But as I passed the Zen Zone, a dreadful corporate invention with beanbags and a birch tree-themed wallpaper, a bank of OLED strips on the ceiling flickered. They didn't just flicker, they snapped. A sharp crackle like a dry twig underfoot. A shower of static sparked in the air, and the lights in that section died. I stopped. The cold drone seemed to deepen in pitch. I shone my torch into the darkness. Nothing, just ergonomic chairs and motivational posters telling me to disrupt the paradigm. I moved on, towards the security office. This was the nexus. This was where the answers should have been. The door was ajar. The police do not cross tape hanging in limp, pathetic strips. Inside, the failure was absolute. Camera and Nin Hong, file log mat, broken. What a quaint term. Broken implies something can be fixed. This was methodical. The wall of monitors, usually displaying 100 angles of the hub, was a canvas of white noise, pure, hissing static, not a blue screen, not no signal. The systems were receiving something that was just raw, visual chaos. The prompt had mentioned static interference and thermal imagery fade. As I watched, one of the screens convulsed. The static resolved, for a fraction of a second, into a ghostly shifting pattern. It looked, impossibly, like a thermal image, a blob of coal blue and pale white, swirling. It was the shape of a human face, screamed into silence, its heat signature fading to zero before my eyes. Then the screen went black. A small pop, and the acrid smell of a burned-out capacitor. I turned to the server rack. This was the black box, the digital memory of the building, the access logs for the keycard system, the local backups of the CCTV footage. The police report said the files were missing. They weren't missing. They were corrupted. I'm no digital forensics expert, but I know what a wipe drive looks like. This wasn't a wipe. This was vandalism. I pulled the drive casing. It felt warm, but the activity lights were dark. I jacked in my own diagnostic tool. The boot-up screen appeared, and then my tablet emitted a noise, a high-pitched glitch crackle that sounded like digital fingernails on a blackboard. The screen filled with junk code, and my device shut down. Hard reset. The systems weren't just broken, they were hostile. I backed out of the room, a new, unwelcome feeling starting to prickle at my scalp. The cold in the building wasn't just the air conditioning. It was an active, seeping presence. This brought me to the last, most disturbing part of the brief, the one detail that had made the underwriters sign my exorbitant fee without a single query. Takaho duduk team tavi tunyet zam haido. They weren't missing, not really. The cleaners had found them, 12 of them, the night shift team. They were found right where I was standing now, in the main co-working space. Some were at their desks, some were in the kitchenette. One was standing by the lift, his thumb still pressed against the call button. They were all just stopped. The paramedics who pronounced them dead had to revise their reports. No vital signs, the first on scene wrote. No signs of trauma, no signs of struggle. It was the coroner who found the anomaly. The temperature, the human body, upon death, cools at a predictable rate. It's called algor mortis. It's a fundamental or reliable law of thermodynamics. You use it to establish a time of death. But these bodies, they broke the law. The ambient temperature in the room had been a consistent, climate-controlled 21 circ. Text, sir. The bodies should have been cooling by roughly 1 degree per hour, but they weren't. When they were found, every single one of them, from the 22-year-old intern to the 48-year-old CFO, registered a core body temperature that was exactly 2 degrees Celsius lower than it should have been. Not $1.9, not $2.1, exactly 2.0 circ. Text, cease. It was a physical impossibility, a universal constant, rewritten. It was as if something had reached inside them and taxed them, siphoning off a precise, measured tithe of their vital warmth, leaving behind a cold, empty vessel. I stood there, in the epicenter of it all. I could feel the cold drone in the soles of my shoes, and beneath it, something else, a new sound, or perhaps a feeling, a slow, rhythmic pulse. The prompt called it a heartbeat. It wasn't, it was the mainframe's water-cooling pumps, deep in the basement, circulating fluid to stop the digital heart of the building from overheating. Thump, thump, thump. The building was functioning perfectly. Its systems were stable. Its heart was beating. It was the occupants who had failed. And then I heard it, the last sound. Hoitho du deo kunyngui homkono day. The steady breathing of those no longer here. It was the ventilation system, the HVAC. It kicked in with a low, mechanical whoosh. Air, recycled and chilled, poured from the ceiling grills. It sounded, in the profound silence, exactly like a slow, deep, mechanical inhalation. And then, a pause, followed by the hiss of the exhale. The building was breathing. I looked down at the last chalk outline, the one by the espresso machine, a cup, a smartphone, the ghost of a life. The whisper narration. That's what the notes had said. It wasn't a sound, it was a thought. My thought. A sudden, terrible hypothesis. This building was a machine, a startup ecosystem designed for one purpose, to extract value, to pull ideas, energy, and work from its inhabitants. What if it had simply become too efficient? What if, in the deep silence of the night, it had finally figured out how to extract the last, most fundamental resource, not their work, not their time, but their heat, I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. The air from the vent washed over me. It felt greedy. I turned to leave. My footsteps echoed on the concrete. Click, clack. And for one agonizing, heart-stopping moment, the echo I heard back was not the click of my own heel. It was the soft, wet shush of a hospital slipper. I froze. Silence. Only the cold drone, only the mechanical breath. But one thing was no longer a constant. One thing had changed. I was cold. A deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the air. I pulled out my phone, my backup device. I opened the simple thermometer app. I held it up. The room was still 21 Celsius. Text, C-TUS. I turned and walked, not ran, to the lift. As the doors slid shut, sealing me in the mirrored box, I looked at my own reflection. I looked pale, strained. I wondered, if I put a thermometer under my tongue, what it would read. 37 circ text, or $36, or perhaps just 35. A perfect, precise drop. A simple 2-degree subtraction. The waving copies. The tracks were a scar of rust cutting through the grey. Indifferent landscape. Ethan walked the sleepers, each step a dull, hollow percussion against the damp wood. There was no destination. There was only the obsessive, grinding need to follow the path that had consumed them. First Daniel, then Clara. Now, him. The air was thin, smelling of iron and something ancient, like wet stone. Above him, the sky was a closed lid of bruised purple. He pulled the collar of his coat tighter, a gesture that offered no warmth, only the familiar friction of wool against his skin. He was an entrepreneur, a problem solver. He dealt in logistics, in systems, in results. This place defied all of it. It was a failed project, an equation with no solution. Wind moved through the skeletal trees lining the embankment. It was not a normal wind. It didn't gust or howl. It sighed, and layered beneath that sigh, almost imperceptible, was another sound, breathing. Faint, rhythmic, and multiplied. Like a crowded room listening intently. Ethan stopped. He listened. He waited. Nothing. Only the crunch of his own boots on the ballast. He was tired. His pursuit of answers for his lost partners had stretched into days, fueled by caffeine, desperation, and the flickering blue dot of a GPS signal that had finally died in this exact desolate corridor. He remembered Daniel's final, frantic call. Daniel, the analyst, the man who saw the world in spreadsheets and predictive models. "It's not right, Ethan," he'd whispered, his voice cracking with a static Ethan had mistaken for a bad connection. "I saw it in the window, the reflection. It wasn't me. It looked satisfied." Ethan had dismissed it. Burnout. Stress. The investors were pulling out. He'd told Daniel to get some sleep. That was the last time they spoke. He walked on. The tracks stretched into an impossible, repeating geometry. He passed a fallen signal post. Its metal rusted into a lace of ochre decay. He passed a graffiti tag on a concrete abutment, a meaningless swirl of faded blue. He passed a dead crow, wings half spread on the gravel. Then, 10 minutes later, he passed the same fallen signal post, the same blue swirl, the same dead crow. He stopped again. His heart, which had been a steady, anxious drum, now skipped. The loop. This was the motif. This was the repetition. He turned and walked back. He found his own footprints in the damp earth. He followed them, a breadcrumb trail of his own existence. The signal post, the graffiti, the crow, and then, ahead of him, the signal post again. He was not just walking a line. He was trapped in a circle that had been disguised as a line. This was Clara's territory. Clara, the creative, the architect of their brand. She saw patterns in chaos. Her last message wasn't a call, but a fragmented voice note left at 3:17 a.m. "The door," it said, her voice unnervingly calm. almost hypnotic. It keeps opening for me. Such a gentleman. Ethan had listened to it a dozen times, trying to decipher the metaphor, a new opportunity, a mental break. It's the last time. Ethan, the note concluded. I'm going through. He's holding it for me. He saw the post. She saw the door. The project looped. Ethan leaned against the cold concrete of the abutment. The blue swirl cool against his palm. He closed his eyes, forcing his analytical mind to take control. There is a rational explanation, he whispered to the wind. The wind answered with that chorus of breathing. Louder now. Inhale, exhale, inhale. He opened his eyes. He was no longer alone. They stood along the edge of the embankment, just beyond the reach of the gravel ballast, their forms flickering like a weak signal. They were silhouettes against the bruised sky, dozens of them, stretching down the line in both directions. They were perfectly still, a silent audience. Ethan's blood turned to ice. This was not grief. This was not fatigue. This was wrong. He was a man of action. Who are you? He shouted. His voice sounded small, absorbed instantly by the damp air. What do you want? The figures did not respond. They simply watched. He took a half step back, his boot heels skidding on a loose stone. The movement triggered something. One of the figures, a tall man in the middle distance, slowly raised a hand. It was not a threat. It was a greeting, a placid, almost lazy wave. Hello, welcome. We've been expecting you. Ethan stared, his mind refusing to process the face. It was indistinct, blurred by the mist and the unnatural light, but the posture was familiar. The tilt of the head, the way the shoulders slouched, as if carrying the weight of a dozen failed ventures. He knew that posture. He saw it in the mirror every morning. He staggered back, a sound choking in his throat. He looked down the line at another figure, this one smaller, more graceful, a woman. She was smiling, a polite, vacant smile of absolute certainty. She, too, raised a hand. The door is open. The meeting is ready. The investors are waiting. Clara, he breathed. The sound was stolen by the wind, which now carried her whispered voice from that final voice note. Such a gentleman. He turned wildly, looking for the first figure he'd seen, the tall one, the one that wore his coat. But it wasn't there. No, he realized with a dawning, sickening horror. It was there. It had just moved. It was no longer on the embankment. It was on the tracks. Closer. It was watching him. And as he looked at it, at the familiar coat, the tired slump, the face blurred not by mist, but by repetition, he finally understood Daniel's last call. It wasn't me, Daniel had said. It looked at me. Daniel hadn't seen a reflection. He had seen this. He had seen his own future, trapped in the system, waiting on the tracks to greet him. He had seen the guide. Clara hadn't seen a polite stranger. She had seen this, her own future self, holding the door of the loop open, inviting her past self to step inside, the system onboarding itself. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes. They were receipts. They were the cached data of a process that never terminated. They were the previous iterations, the failed prototypes, the human refuse left behind by a system that demanded everything and gave nothing. The project failed. The funding collapsed. The launch was a disaster. All the stress, all the burnout, all the grinding repetition of their lives as creators and entrepreneurs. It hadn't been the path to this place. It was this place. They had been on these tracks for years. No, Ethan said. He turned to run. He would break the loop. He would find the exit. He was a problem solver. He would solve this. He ran back the way he came, his feet flying over the sleepers, the signal post, the graffiti, the crow. He poured every ounce of his adrenaline into his escape. He would not become a waving, smiling copy. He would not be the guide for the next victim. He ran until his lungs burned, until the amplified sound of his own breathing drowned out the wind. Inhale, exhale, inhale. It sounded like a chorus. He rounded a shallow curve, the trees thinning, and stopped dead. Ahead of him, walking slowly through the mist, was a figure, a man, his coat pulled tight, his head down, looking at the ground as if searching for a signal. The man looked up, his face pale with exhaustion and confusion. Ethan stared. He knew that face. He knew that coat. He knew that specific, desperate exhaustion. It was him. A version of him from an hour ago. The version that was still looking for Daniel and Clara. The version that still believed there was a solution. Ethan watched himself. This other Ethan. Stop. The other Ethan was staring at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. A terrible, automatic calm settled over Ethan. The burning in his lungs ceased. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. The system required a function. The process demanded a trigger. He was no longer the participant. He was the mechanism. He heard the sound again. The chorus of breathing from the figures hidden in the trees. The echoes of Daniel and Clara. They were all around him, waiting. Join us. It's fine. The loop is stable. The lost man on the tracks, the man who was Ethan, took a half step back, his boot skidding on a loose stone. Ethan felt an impulse rise within him, an automatic gesture of reassurance, a polite welcome, a contractual obligation. He raised his hand. He waved, slowly. He saw the recognition click in the other man's eyes. He saw the understanding of the trap. He saw himself, trapped. He waved. She smiled. The door opened. The new Ethan stared, his face a mask of dawning horror. And from the trees, the copies of Daniel and Clara watched, their movements a perfect, mirrored loop. They were not guiding a stranger. They were not welcoming a new victim. They were, all of them, forever, just waving goodbye to themselves. What do you think? Have you ever felt that icy, watching presence in a transitional space, an empty airport terminal, a sterile hotel room, or a late-night train? What do you believe the reflection in the mirror truly wants? This story touches on a deep-seated fear common in many Asian cultures, the spiritual vulnerability of liminal spaces. Places like hotels and trains aren't just pathways. They are considered temporary, unclaimed territories because they lack the spiritual protection of a home. The veil between our world and the spirit realm is dangerously thin. Entities are drawn to these locations, seeking to anchor themselves to the living. And the mirror? In these traditions, a mirror is never just glass. It's a portal, acknowledging the reflection, like waving, isn't just seeing yourself. It's interpreted as a conscious invitation, a way of telling the shadow on the other side, yes, I see you. Come through. If you have a story about a close call in a hotel or a strange reflection you can't explain, share it in the comments below. We want to hear it. And if you want to make sure you never miss another story from the shadows, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications.